May 28, 1945, Mondorf-les-Bains, Luxembourg. The scratching sound of a pencil faded into silence. Across the table, General Alfred Jodl froze mid-note, his attention locked on the American intelligence officer facing him. As the explanation continued, the general's posture stiffened, then sagged. The implications were impossible to ignore. "You are saying," Jodl finally responded, voice tight with disbelief, "that General Patton's Army Group, the first United States Army Group, was never real?" The officer answered with a restrained nod. In that moment, a carefully constructed worldview collapsed. For more than 2 years, the German High Command had organized its defenses, shifted divisions, and committed enormous resources in response to a military force that existed only on paper, in radio signals, and in carefully staged illusions. What emerged during that interrogation was not merely a revelation of error, but a brutal accounting of scale. A deception effort involving fewer than 3,000 Allied specialists had effectively immobilized and misdirected nearly 500,000 German troops without engaging them in combat. The defeat had not come from artillery barrages or overwhelming manpower, but from manipulation of perception itself. Jodl, like most senior German commanders, could not yet grasp the full dimensions of what had occurred. Only decades later, through declassified files, intelligence summaries, and first-hand testimony, would historians fully piece together the story. The Allies had not simply misled Germany, they had engineered the most complex and successful military deception ever executed. This campaign relied on methods that bordered on the absurd, yet proved devastatingly effective. Inflatable armored vehicles weighing under 100 pounds were deployed to resemble 32-ton Sherman tanks. Fake airfields appeared overnight. Entire divisions were invented, complete with insignia, movement schedules, and logistical footprints. Artists trained in theater and advertising designed visual illusions, while radio operators flooded German intelligence channels with convincing but fabricated communications. Even more astonishing was the role of human intelligence. Double agents, some so trusted that Adolf Hitler personally honored them, supplied detailed warnings of invasions that would never happen. These reports aligned perfectly with German expectations, reinforcing beliefs the Nazi leadership already held. The consequence was catastrophic misallocation. Throughout the critical months of 1944, German forces remained fixed in areas that never came under attack, guarding coastlines and routes threatened only by shadows. The strategic groundwork for this operation was laid on December 6, 1943, when the Allied Combined Chiefs of Staff approved Operation Bodyguard. Its purpose was comprehensive: to obscure the timing, location, and scale of the Allied invasion of Western Europe. Unlike earlier ruses, Bodyguard was not a single deception, but a coordinated system of false narratives stretching from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. Fictitious armies appeared in Scotland, southern England, and North Africa. Simulated invasion preparations were staged across thousands of miles. Every element, troop movements, supply buildup, and communications traffic, was designed to suggest multiple threats, ensuring German forces could never confidently concentrate their defenses. Central to this effort was a small but extraordinarily influential organization, the London Controlling Section, formed in 1942 under Colonel John Bevan. Operating discreetly from offices beneath Whitehall, this group functioned as the nerve center of Allied deception. Their task was not to create a single lie, but to manage an interlocking web of misinformation so consistent and persistent that it became indistinguishable from reality. Their tools were subtle but powerful. Intelligence leaks were timed precisely. Double agents were fed information tailored to German analytical habits. Every falsehood was supported by observable evidence, from aerial reconnaissance targets to intercepted radio chatter. The scale of the challenge was immense. By early 1944, Germany had stationed roughly 58 divisions, around 850,000 troops across Western Europe. If even a fraction of these forces could be kept away from the true landing zone, the chances of Allied success would dramatically rise. Each misplaced division translated into fewer defenders on the beaches of Normandy, and ultimately, fewer Allied casualties. Yet the brilliance of Operation Bodyguard did not lie solely in its logistics. Its real innovation was psychological. British intelligence devoted years to studying German command culture and, most critically, Adolf Hitler himself. Analysts identified his fixation on the Pas-de-Calais as the most logical invasion route. His tendency to distrust information that contradicted his instincts, and his habit of interpreting intelligence through preconceived strategic assumptions. The deception plan was built to exploit these traits, not challenge them. Every false report reinforced what Hitler already believed. Every fabricated threat confirmed his expectations. In effect, German intelligence was encouraged to deceive itself. Historian Thaddeus Holt would later observe that this marked a turning point in warfare. For the first time, an entire military campaign was structured around controlling enemy perception rather than destroying enemy forces. Victory would be achieved by shaping belief. On January 20, 1944, this philosophy took physical form at Camp Forest, Tennessee. There, the U.S. Army activated an unconventional unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, later known as the Ghost Army. Unlike traditional combat units, its ranks were filled with painters, sculptors, architects, sound engineers, and graphic designers, individuals selected not for marksmanship but for imagination. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers specialized in visual deception, drawing talent from elite art institutions such as Pratt Institute, Cooper Union, and the Philadelphia Museum School of Industrial Art. Among their members were young creatives who would later leave permanent marks on American culture, including fashion designer Bill Blass and future minimalist painter Ellsworth Kelly. Their mission was to manufacture credibility. Using lightweight materials and forced perspective, they created convincing replicas of military hardware. Entire camps could be assembled, photographed by enemy reconnaissance, and dismantled within hours. Mass production of these illusions occurred at the U.S. Rubber Company's Alice Mills facility in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. There, workers, many of them teenage girls earning modest hourly wages, assembled inflatable tanks, artillery pieces, and transport vehicles from rubberized fabric and neoprene. What emerged from the factory floor would soon convince German aerial observers that powerful armored divisions were massing where none actually existed. Together, these efforts formed a weapon unlike any previously deployed. It did not explode or burn, it persuaded. And in persuading, it reshaped the battlefield before the first Allied soldier ever set foot on the beaches of Normandy. During the Second World War, Allied deception units achieved a level of technical and psychological sophistication that rivaled genuine combat operations. One of the most striking examples was the use of inflatable replicas of the M4 Sherman tank. When packed, each dummy vehicle weighed only about 93 pounds and could be transported by a small team. Once on site, gasoline-powered air compressors brought these rubber constructs to full size in roughly 20 minutes. At a viewing distance of around 400 yards, the standard altitude and range of German aerial reconnaissance, these decoys were visually indistinguishable from real armored vehicles. The realism extended far beyond simple shape and size. The inflatable tanks were painted with accurate unit markings and insignia, and even showed artificial scuffs, dirt, and weathering to suggest long-term use. Engineers devised methods to create convincing track impressions in the soil, employing bulldozers fitted with specially designed attachments. Vehicles were never aligned in perfect rows. Instead, they were positioned at slightly awkward angles, recreating the casual disorder typical of real military bivouacs. In a particularly clever twist, camouflage was applied imperfectly on purpose. Enemy reconnaissance aircraft would spot tanks that appeared sloppily concealed, reinforcing the illusion that these were genuine positions occupied by overconfident or hurried troops. Oversight of these elaborate visual illusions fell to Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simonson, commander of the 6003rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion. Under his direction, soldiers were trained with an almost theatrical attention to detail. Entire military facilities could be assembled in a single night. Motor pools, ammunition dumps, supply yards, and command centers that looked fully operational by dawn. The men studied the everyday routines of active combat units, learning when laundry was typically hung to dry, when vehicles were serviced, and when smoke from field kitchens would be visible. These rhythms of daily life were carefully reproduced, transforming static decoys into environments that appeared genuinely inhabited. While the engineers focused on deceiving enemy eyes, the 31,132nd Signal Service Company specialized in fooling enemy ears. In cooperation with Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey, they pioneered a form of sonic deception that had no precedent in warfare. Their equipment included powerful 500B speakers mounted on modified M10 tank destroyers. These systems could project sound over distances of up to 15 miles, far beyond the capabilities of conventional loudspeakers. What they produced was not simple noise, but carefully engineered acoustic simulations of large military formations. Bell Labs scientists constructed detailed environmental models to predict how sound traveled under different conditions. Variables such as temperature, humidity, wind direction, and terrain were meticulously calculated. For example, a recording of tanks grinding through mud on a cold 40-degree morning required entirely different amplification and frequency adjustments than the same recording played on a warmer 70-degree day. Without these corrections, the illusion would collapse under trained enemy analysis. The sound library assembled for these operations was astonishing in its scope. At Fort Knox, engineers recorded armored vehicles moving at various speeds across multiple surfaces, including asphalt, gravel, mud, and grass. Each session used several microphone placements to capture depth and spatial variation. The recordings preserved the distinctive acoustic signatures of different tank models: the sharp, high-pitched whine of the M5 Stuart light tank, the heavier, throaty rumble of the Sherman, and even the squeal produced by worn or poorly maintained tracks. Construction activities were also documented in detail. Bridge building sounds were broken into components, pile drivers hammering supports, welding torches hissing, officers barking orders, and pontoons splashing into rivers. Staff Sergeant John Shilstone, a civilian sound engineer before the war, played a key role in transforming these raw recordings into immersive soundscapes. By distributing multiple speakers at varying distances, he created the illusion of movement through space. Armored columns seemed to approach, pass, and recede, complete with convincing Doppler shifts as vehicles moved past imagined listening posts. German acoustic intelligence units, trained to identify Allied formations by sound alone, reported detecting massive armored concentrations that existed only as carefully synchronized audio performances. Psychological realism extended into the smallest details. The sound teams recorded casual complaints about bad food, sergeants threatening discipline over trivial mistakes, and engines refusing to start in cold weather. These background noises were layered beneath the primary effects, producing an auditory environment so convincing that many local French civilians later insisted they had seen tanks that in reality they had only heard. Perhaps the most technically demanding aspect of the deception effort was radio simulation. Experienced radio operators developed distinctive transmission styles known as a fist, as recognizable as handwriting. German signals intelligence, among the most advanced of the war, cataloged these patterns to track Allied unit movements. To counter this, the Ghost Army had to imitate not just message volume, but the individual quirks of hundreds of operators using SCR-399 radio systems. A force of 296 signal specialists maintained the electronic footprint of entire divisions. IBM punch card machines were employed to generate random 5-letter code groups that closely resembled authentic encrypted traffic. Private First Class Lester Friedman devoted weeks to studying recordings of specific Allied radio operators, learning to replicate their unique rhythms, pauses, and habits. Radio traffic followed strict timetables that mirrored real operational behavior. Morning reports at 0600 hours, logistical requests around 10 o'clock, and evening situation summaries at 1800. Through the precise coordination of visual decoys, sound projection, and radio deception, the Ghost Army constructed a convincing illusion of military power. What appeared to German intelligence as vast, mobile combat forces were, in truth, elaborate performances, engineered with scientific rigor, executed with artistic sensitivity, and deployed with strategic intent. During the preparatory phase of Allied deception operations, entire radio networks were deliberately staged to appear careless and flawed. Operators intentionally made mistakes. Routine communications were occasionally sent without encryption, emergency messages were transmitted openly, and traffic volume was allowed to rise conspicuously before what appeared to be large-scale maneuvers. These patterns closely mirrored real military behavior. Across occupied Western Europe, German interception units stationed in well-equipped facilities in France and Belgium meticulously recorded every signal they detected. Over time, these intercepted messages allowed German analysts to assemble comprehensive intelligence assessments of Allied forces that, in reality, existed only on paper. While the specialized unit, later known as the Ghost Army, refined its own tools of illusion, a far broader strategic deception, codenamed Operation Fortitude, was unfolding throughout Britain. This overarching plan was divided into two distinct branches. Fortitude North aimed to persuade German planners that an Allied invasion of Norway was imminent, while Fortitude South suggested that the primary blow would fall at the Pas de Calais. Each scenario required its own carefully constructed web of false information, infrastructure, and signals. Responsibility for tactical deception within the 21st Army Group was assigned to Colonel David Strangeways, a highly capable intelligence officer who had previously served under Bernard Montgomery during the North African Campaign. On February 23, 1944, Strangeways conducted a sweeping overhaul of the Fortitude South concept. He recognized that decoys and physical props alone would never be convincing enough to mislead German intelligence at the highest levels. Instead, Strangeways proposed a system built around controlled human intelligence, specifically double agents, supported by deliberately crafted radio communications. Physical deception would still exist, but its role would be secondary, serving mainly to reinforce what German intelligence already believed through intercepted reports. At the heart of this new framework stood a fictional force, the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG. This imaginary formation was placed under the nominal command of General George S. Patton, a decision designed to capture immediate German attention. To German intelligence officers, Patton was regarded as the most aggressive and capable American battlefield commander. His sudden disappearance from public view following the controversial incidents in Sicily only intensified their curiosity. German analysts were convinced that wherever Patton reappeared, the main Allied invasion would surely follow. The fabricated structure of FUSAG was extraordinarily detailed. On paper, it consisted of two armies, the 1st Canadian Army, which was real but deployed elsewhere, and the 3rd U.S. Army, which existed but had not yet become operational. Beneath these commands were 11 divisions, some genuine units stationed far from southern England, others entirely fictional creations. Among the non-existent formations were the 17th U.S. Infantry Division, the 11th U.S. Armored Division, and the 35th U.S. Airborne Division. Each of these units was supplied with a full administrative identity, including insignia designs, command hierarchies, operational histories, and plausible deployment schedules. To support the illusion, extensive physical preparations were carried out across southeastern England, particularly in Kent, Essex, and East Anglia. These regions appeared to be teeming with invasion activity. At the port of Dover alone, 255 dummy landing craft, known informally as Big Bobs and Wet Bobs, were placed in the harbor. Constructed from scaffolding, canvas, and oil drums, these replicas were surprisingly complex. Transporting a single dummy craft required 6 or 7 3-ton trucks carrying more than 500 individual components. Assembly was labor-intensive. A team of 20 men needed approximately 6 hours to put one decoy vessel together. Once completed, each weighed around 8 tons, light enough that strong winds frequently caused them to capsize, forcing constant repairs and replacements. Despite these flaws, the illusion was convincing from the air and from a distance. What German intelligence did not realize was that by 1944, every agent they believed to be operating independently inside Britain was in fact under British control. This extraordinary situation was the result of the double-cross system administered by MI5's 20 Committee, its name derived from the Roman numerals XX, symbolizing the turning of enemy agents. The double-cross system stands as one of the most comprehensive counterintelligence triumphs in history. Its most valuable asset was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish civilian driven by a personal determination to undermine Nazi Germany. In 1941, Pujol approached both British and German intelligence services offering his services. Initially dismissed by the British, he succeeded in persuading German Abwehr officers in Madrid that he could establish an espionage network inside the United Kingdom. Operating from Lisbon, armed with nothing more than a tourist guidebook, railway schedules, and remarkable creativity, Pujol invented an entire network of fictitious informants. His reports to Germany were so detailed and convincing that British authorities became alarmed by the apparent effectiveness of an unknown enemy agent. On April 24, 1942, MI5 finally intervened and brought Pujol to Britain via Gibraltar. He was given the code name Garbo, while the Germans knew him as Arabelle. Together with his British handler, Thomas Harris, Pujol constructed what remains the most elaborate double-agent operation ever conducted. From an unremarkable office on Jermyn Street in London, Garbo and Harris managed a non-existent intelligence network of 27 sub-agents supposedly spread across Britain and beyond. Each imaginary operative possessed a carefully developed background, personality traits, political views, personal struggles, and motivations. One agent was described as a Venezuelan student in Glasgow with communist leanings. Another was portrayed as a waiter from Gibraltar employed at a Navy facility, gathering intelligence from careless military conversations. A third was a Welsh former sailor in Swansea who allegedly coordinated a group of nationalist sympathizers. As circumstances required, agents could be removed from the narrative. When maintaining reports from Scotland became inconvenient, Garbo arranged for one sub-agent to be killed during the North African campaign. He informed German intelligence of the death and even placed a corresponding obituary in British newspapers to reinforce the story. German confidence in Garbo grew to astonishing levels. In July 1941, they transferred £20,000, equivalent to approximately £1.25 million in 2023, through the Japanese embassy to finance his fictional network. They sent him detailed intelligence questionnaires outlining their specific priorities and ultimately honored him with the Iron Cross First Class on July 29, 1944. By that point, the deception had succeeded beyond expectation. The Allied High Command continued to anticipate an invasion at Pas-de-Calais long after Allied forces had landed in Normandy, waiting for an army that never existed, commanded by a general who was never there. One of the very few non-military individuals ever granted this distinction, he was part of an Allied effort that transformed deception into a sophisticated science. By the final years of the war, misleading the enemy was no longer limited to inflatable tanks or crude decoys. Instead, it became an integrated system designed to withstand scrutiny from the air, on the ground, and across the electromagnetic spectrum. Under the framework of Operations Quicksilver 1 through VI, the Allies constructed an entirely imaginary military presence across southeastern England. This phantom force was supported by a meticulously crafted environment that mirrored real operational behavior. Artificial lighting systems, known as Q sites, were installed to imitate the nighttime illumination patterns of large military bases. These lights were deliberately dimmed and inconsistently masked, giving the impression of blackout conditions enforced by imperfect discipline, exactly what German observers expected to see. After dark, vehicle headlights traced carefully planned routes, simulating steady nighttime traffic between camps, depots, and headquarters. From the air, this movement suggested a living, functioning army. On the ground, specialized units such as the 46th Combat Engineers refined the art of physical deception. Their task was not merely to build props, but to fabricate convincing evidence of sustained military activity. They learned to manipulate terrain itself. By fitting bulldozers with modified tracks, they recreated the distinctive tread patterns of specific vehicles. A Sherman tank, for example, left tracks just under 19 inches wide, marked by recognizable rubber block impressions. Engineers replicated these precisely. They also studied how tanks pivoted when turning, how soil responded differently under the weight of loaded versus empty vehicles, and how oil, fuel, and coolant leaks produced characteristic stains. Even these subtle details were reproduced to deceive aerial photography analysts. Entire dummy fuel depots appeared along the southern coast, assembled from disguised sewage pipes, wooden frames, and netting. From reconnaissance altitude, these sites were indistinguishable from real installations. They included perimeter fencing, guard posts, and roadways marked with fresh vehicle tracks that implied regular supply operations. To enhance realism, planners introduced deliberate flaws. A damaged truck left by the roadside, a partially collapsed camouflage net, or a carelessly placed crate. These imperfections made the illusion more believable. The coordination extended underground. Deep within the tunnels carved into the white cliffs near Dover lay the heart of the radio deception campaign. Here, rows of transmitters operated around the clock, sustaining the electronic footprint of the first U.S. Army group, known as FUSAG. Operators worked in rotating shifts, maintaining consistent transmission habits that German direction-finding stations could follow and map. Transmitters were placed where divisional and corps headquarters were supposed to be, ensuring that radio intelligence confirmed what pilots reported from the sky. German intelligence, despite its reputation for rigor, was plagued by internal weaknesses that made it especially vulnerable to such manipulation. By 1941, the Abwehr employed more than 20,000 personnel, yet its effectiveness was undermined by rivalry with the SS intelligence service, the Sicherheitsdienst. These overlapping jurisdictions bred mistrust and inefficiency, conditions the Allies exploited relentlessly. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who led the Abwehr until early 1944, was himself an unreliable pillar of the Nazi system. His commitment to the regime was doubtful, and his organization had been infiltrated not only by Allied agents, but also by members of the German resistance. His deputy, Colonel Hans Oster, actively worked to sabotage Nazi objectives from within. After Canaris was arrested following the failed July 20th plot against Hitler, the Abwehr was absorbed into the Reich Security Main Office under Walter Schellenberg, a reorganization that further disrupted intelligence operations. Within this fractured system, the Foreign Armies West Department bore responsibility for assessing Allied strength. Its commander, Colonel Alexis von Rohn, led a small analytical staff charged with interpreting a flood of often contradictory reports. Von Rohn, a devout Christian associated with the Confessing Church, quietly opposed the Nazi regime while serving at one of its most sensitive analytical posts. His assessments consistently overstated Allied capabilities, not by accident, but as an act of deliberate resistance. As reports about FUSOG accumulated from multiple channels, double agents, aerial reconnaissance, intercepted radio traffic, von Rohn validated them and pushed them upward through the chain of command. In May 1944, he estimated that nearly 90 Allied divisions were stationed in Britain, when fewer than half that number actually existed. He identified American formations as combat-ready weeks before they could realistically be deployed. These exaggerated estimates, bearing his authority, reached Hitler and the highest levels of German command. German signals intelligence, though technically advanced and staffed by capable specialists, was undone by its own assumptions. Analysts intercepted authentic transmissions from real Allied units that the British had intentionally linked to FUSOG's fictional command structure. A genuine British infantry division stationed in Scotland, for example, was confidently assigned to the imaginary army group based on carefully planted radio traffic. By blending reality with fabrication, the Allies created a web so dense that German analysts could not separate truth from invention. The deception relied not on a single source, but on a carefully orchestrated network of double agents. Juan Pujol Garcia, known to the Germans as Garbo, was only one voice in a much larger chorus. Duško Popov, codenamed Tricycle, played the role of a charismatic Serbian socialite who moved effortlessly through elite circles where secrets were supposedly exchanged as casually as drinks. His reports, crafted by British intelligence, mixed accurate but harmless details with outdated information and crucial falsehoods about Allied plans. Roman Czerniawski, operating under the codename Brutus, brought a different kind of credibility. A former Polish Air Force officer and resistance organizer, he had first-hand military experience that made his assessments persuasive. After his capture and supposed conversion, he was allowed to operate from Britain, transmitting intelligence back to German handlers in Paris. In late May 1944, just days before the Normandy landings, Brutus reported that FUSOG remained poised in southeastern England, awaiting orders for what he described as the primary invasion. Wolf Schmidt, known as Tate, was perhaps the most enduring of all double agents. Parachuted into Britain in 1940, he was captured almost immediately and turned. For nearly 5 years, he transmitted reports to Hamburg without ever arousing suspicion. His reliability was so trusted that his deliberately inaccurate information about V1 and V2 impact sites led German commanders to adjust their targeting away from central London. Maintaining this vast deception required extraordinary coordination. Each agent's reports had to align with the others without appearing scripted. Their information needed to reflect their supposed access, strategic insights from some, logistical details from others. Timing was everything. Discoveries had to be reported in sequences that matched German expectations of how intelligence was gathered and processed. In the end, the success of the operation lay not in a single trick, but in the seamless integration of thousands of details, physical, visual, electronic, and human, woven together into a convincing illusion that reshaped the course of the war. As the final days of May 1944 unfolded, the Allied deception campaign entered its most delicate and decisive phase. Every fabricated signal, every staged movement, and every false report now had to align flawlessly. The success of the Normandy landings depended not only on military strength, but on sustaining a single crucial illusion, that the real Allied invasion would strike elsewhere. If German armored formations were freed to rush into Normandy within the first 2 days, the landings could collapse before a foothold was secured. At the center of this deception stood Juan Pujol Garcia, known to German intelligence as Garbo. On May 29, he initiated a carefully orchestrated surge of intelligence traffic. Reports from his fictional agents painted a picture of escalating urgency without crossing the line into actionable clarity. One operative, supposedly stationed near Southampton, described enormous troop assemblies forming in the ports. Another, based in Swansea, claimed to observe supply convoys moving southward in steady streams. These dispatches, transmitted through Madrid, suggested an operation on the verge of execution while withholding precise timing or location, an intentional ambiguity designed to keep German planners cautious rather than reactive. Meanwhile, in Britain, the units tasked with physical deception intensified their efforts. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, later known as the Ghost Army, transformed large areas of eastern England into convincing illusions of military power. Entire staging zones appeared where no real formations existed. Inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery were deployed across open fields, partially hidden beneath camouflage netting that subtly failed to conceal them completely. The goal was not perfection, but plausibility. Radio specialists operated continuously, flooding the airwaves with fabricated communications that mirrored the traffic expected before a major assault. At night and before dawn, sound units broadcast recordings of engines revving, metal clanking, and troop movement, audio cues meant to be intercepted by German listeners. From the air, the illusion was reinforced as Allied aircraft dropped strips of aluminum foil, known as window or chaff, in precise patterns that mimicked large bomber formations heading toward the Pas-de-Calais. Naval deception followed the same logic. Fast boats towed radar reflectors that produced the electronic profile of massive invasion fleets. On the night of June 5th into June 6th, Operations Taxable and Glimmer simulated two phantom armadas advancing toward Cap d'Antifer and the Pas-de-Calais coastline. German intelligence struggled to verify what it believed it was seeing. Allied air superiority severely restricted reconnaissance flights, forcing Luftwaffe pilots to operate at extreme altitudes, often above 33,000 feet, to avoid anti-aircraft fire. The photographs they captured appeared to confirm the Allied buildup in southeastern England. Analysts counted what seemed to be hundreds of armored vehicles, thousands of support trucks, and extensive landing craft concentrations. In reality, nearly all of it was artificial. At 1:35 a.m. on June 6, 1944, as Allied airborne troops were descending over Normandy, German intelligence assessments still concluded that the primary invasion force had not yet moved. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, received initial reports of landings with deep skepticism. To him, this appeared to be precisely the diversion predicted by Operation Fortitude. The true blow, he believed, was yet to come at the Pas-de-Calais. This assumption shaped the German reaction during the invasion's most critical hours. Orders were briefly issued for elite armored units, including the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and the Panzer Lehr Division, together representing roughly 500 tanks and 40,000 troops, to move toward Normandy. Almost immediately, those orders were reversed. Concerns about a larger assault across the Channel overrode the reports from Normandy. The final authority rested with Adolf Hitler himself. Convinced that Normandy was a feint, he refused to release the strategic panzer reserves under his direct control. This decision froze some of Germany's most powerful formations in place during the decisive opening phase of the invasion. At 3 a.m., Garbo transmitted the most important message of his career. Having learned of the Normandy landings through his fabricated network, he relayed accurate information to German handlers, but deliberately too late to influence immediate action. The timing was perfect, late enough to avoid enabling a response, yet precise enough to reinforce his credibility. Then came the decisive manipulation. Garbo reported that another agent had uncovered preparations for an even larger Allied force poised to embark, asserting that Normandy was merely a distraction intended to draw German reserves away from the real objective. According to this report, the main invasion would strike the Pas de Calais once German armor committed elsewhere. German intelligence embraced this assessment without hesitation. It aligned seamlessly with their expectations. The war diary of the 15th Army recorded the conclusion that Allied forces were attempting to lure German reserves toward Normandy in order to clear the path for a decisive blow at another location. General Hans von Salmuth, commanding the 15th Army, maintained his full strength, 18 divisions totaling nearly 200,000 combat troops arrayed defensively around the Pas de Calais. Remarkably, this belief persisted. Even 3 days after D-Day, German intelligence continued to classify Normandy as a secondary operation. Intercepted communications revealed Hitler stating on June 11th that he still anticipated the main invasion at any moment. It was not until late July, 7 weeks after Allied forces had landed, that German leadership finally accepted that Normandy was the sole invasion front. By that time, Allied armies had broken out of the beachhead, and the opportunity to contain them had passed. Following the landings, the Ghost Army redeployed across the Channel to apply its craft on the European continent. Their role shifted from strategic deception on a grand scale to tactical misdirection directly on the battlefield. The guiding principle, however, remained unchanged: convince the enemy to observe imaginary forces while overlooking real ones. Operation Elephant, conducted between July 1st and July 4th near Normandy, exemplified this evolution. With only 600 personnel, the Ghost Army created the illusion of the 2nd Armored Division's presence, simulating a force of approximately 15,000 soldiers and hundreds of vehicles. German artillery units, deceived by these fabricated positions, expended vast quantities of ammunition shelling inflatable tanks and empty trenches. As the campaign progressed, deception techniques became increasingly sophisticated. During Operation Brittany in August 1944, the Ghost Army simulated Task Force A, implying an assault on Brest from an unexpected direction. Radio operators deliberately transmitted misleading messages in clear language, accidentally revealing false attack schedules. Sound units broadcast recordings of bridge construction at non-existent river crossings, drawing German attention away from real maneuver routes. By late August, during operations around Brest, the deception reached new levels of refinement. Task Force Mason, entirely fictitious, was presented so convincingly that German intelligence reported the presence of a full armored division. In reality, only a few dozen specialists were responsible for maintaining the illusion. Captured German soldiers later confirmed that their commanders had repositioned reserves based on these false threats. The Ghost Army continuously adapted to enemy expectations. Static equipment raised suspicion, so inflatable vehicles were repositioned nightly. Heat signatures were fabricated using burning oil drums concealed beneath fake armor to deceive infrared detection. Supply depots were gradually assembled before imaginary attacks, reflecting realistic logistical buildup patterns rather than sudden appearances. The true scale of German miscalculation becomes evident when examining force deployments. The 15th Army, Germany's strongest formation in France, remained immobilized near the Pas de Calais throughout the decisive weeks following D-Day. Among its ranks were elite units, including the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and the 116th Panzer Division Windhund. They waited for an invasion that never came. Each German field division was generally built around a core of nearly 15,000 soldiers, reinforced by large numbers of armored vehicles, artillery batteries, and logistical units. If only a portion of the German 15th Army had been released toward Normandy during the critical days immediately following the Allied landings, the fragile foothold on the beaches might not have survived. Instead, those forces remained stationary, waiting for an attack that never existed beyond the realm of German intelligence assessments. This immobilization was not accidental. It reflected a deep misreading of Allied intentions. German High Command had committed its strongest defensive preparations to the Pas-de-Calais region, convinced that this area represented the true invasion point. At Calais and its surrounding coastline, the Wehrmacht assembled an immense barrier. Thousands of artillery pieces, sprawling minefields containing millions of explosives, vast arrays of anti-landing obstacles, and hundreds of reinforced concrete bunkers and firing positions. The scale of this defensive network far exceeded anything constructed along the Normandy coast. By contrast, the German 7th Army, which was responsible for defending the beaches actually targeted by the Allies, was comparatively understrength. It consisted of only 8 divisions, totaling roughly 120,000 men, many of whom lacked sufficient armor and mobile reserves. This imbalance in troop concentration was not a matter of chance. It was a direct consequence of German confidence in the fictional threat posed by the so-called First U.S. Army Group. The same pattern of misjudgment extended to German naval and air assets. What remained of the Kriegsmarine surface fleet and its dwindling submarine force was positioned to confront an invasion fleet expected to cross the narrowest point of the English Channel. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe, already weakened by years of attrition, focused its limited fighter coverage over coastal sectors that would never see Allied landing craft. Reconnaissance missions that might have revealed the deception were instead tasked with observing fabricated troop camps, dummy vehicles, and false radio traffic. Beyond the movement of armies and equipment, the deception exerted a heavy psychological toll on German command personnel. Senior officers such as General Alfred Jodl and Hans Speidel later described the constant strain of preparing for an enemy that seemed omnipresent yet invisible. Intelligence staffs labored for extended shifts, poring over reports of divisions, armored units, and supply movements that existed only on paper. Field commanders felt the confusion most acutely. Major Hans von Luck, leading a panzer battalion within the 21st Panzer Division, recalled the chaos of D-Day itself. His unit received multiple, often contradictory orders within a single day, forcing repeated redeployments based on inaccurate intelligence. These unnecessary movements drained fuel reserves, exhausted crews, and delayed any coherent response to the real invasion. For the ordinary German soldier stationed along the Atlantic Wall, the deception manifested as relentless uncertainty. Guards reported phantom convoys at sea, shadows and echoes that vanished upon closer inspection. One infantryman, Klaus Fischer, wrote home describing strange fleets appearing offshore at night, later revealed to be the result of Allied radar deception techniques. Continuous false alarms gradually eroded discipline, morale, and readiness. The effects rippled outward into civilian life. Members of the French resistance documented how German units seized food, labor, and materials to reinforce defenses against threats that had been carefully manufactured by Allied planners. Local populations suffered shortages and disruption as a result of preparations for invasions that would never occur. In one notable episode near the Channel coast, German long-range artillery units expended valuable ammunition bombarding decoy installations, unaware that the real Allied buildup was unfolding elsewhere without interference. Only gradually did doubts begin to surface within German intelligence circles.
These doubts became more visible through the interrogation of captured personnel. Captain Wilhelm Detmer, taken prisoner in Normandy in mid-June 1944, openly questioned why the anticipated assault by Fusag had not materialized. He explained that German intelligence estimates still placed more than 24 Allied divisions in southeastern England. His captors neither corrected nor encouraged this belief, maintaining the illusion as Allied forces pushed inland. As the campaign progressed and German headquarters were overrun, captured documents revealed the extraordinary depth of the deception. Maps recovered from 15th Army command posts depicted entire Allied formations with precise unit symbols, supply routes, and movement schedules, none of which corresponded to real forces. Intelligence summaries tracked imaginary divisions with meticulous detail, demonstrating how thoroughly German analysts had been misled. For those who eventually confronted the truth, the realization was crushing. Colonel Otto Hoffmann, a senior intelligence officer captured later in the summer, initially rejected the claim that Fusag had never existed. When presented with evidence, photographs of inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and staged encampments, he reportedly remarked that Germany's defeat was compounded by humiliation. The full extent of the failure only emerged after the war, during systematic interrogations conducted at Mondorf-les-Bains in Luxembourg. There, senior German officers were questioned extensively by Allied intelligence services. In July 1945, General Wilhelm Keitel acknowledged that German intelligence had been completely deceived. He admitted that assumptions had shaped analysis and that Allied planners had exploited those expectations with devastating precision. Behind the deception stood an unlikely group of American soldiers whose wartime work foreshadowed remarkable civilian careers. Among them was Bill Bloss, who had helped design and paint inflatable military equipment before becoming a leading figure in American fashion. His talent for illusion, once applied to canvas and rubber, later transformed haute couture. Another was Ellsworth Kelly, who served as a camouflage artist and would go on to define minimalist and hard-edge painting. The bold forms and visual discipline of his later art echoed techniques first developed to conceal armies and mislead the enemy. Together, these efforts formed one of the most effective strategic deceptions in modern military history, one that shaped the outcome of the Normandy campaign without firing a single shot. Camouflage, as it was practiced during the Second World War, began with a paradox: the deliberate effort to erase what existed. Yet for some of the artists involved, the work gradually transformed into its opposite, the craft of giving form to what was not there at all. One veteran later reflected that his creative life shifted from concealing objects to persuading observers that emptiness itself contained substance. This conceptual reversal would shape not only wartime deception, but also the artistic legacies that followed. Among those assigned to the 6003rd Engineers was Art Kane, who would later gain recognition for his iconic photographs of jazz legends, including the famed Esquire gathering known as A Great Day in Harlem. Kane's wartime responsibilities demanded a deep understanding of visual rhythm and composition, how attention could be guided, distracted, or redirected. These lessons were learned not in galleries or studios, but through the construction of military installations that existed purely as staged impressions, designed to collapse under scrutiny, yet endure long enough to deceive.
Arthur Singer Jr., another artist recruited for camouflage work, later became celebrated for his Birds of North America postage stamp series. During the war, his meticulous eye was sharpened by the challenge of transforming rubber and canvas into convincing imitations of machinery and infrastructure. From these experiences emerged a shared realization among the artist soldiers. Successful deception did not rely on flawless imitation. Instead, it depended on aligning with expectations. An object only needed to resemble what an enemy analyst anticipated seeing from high altitude. Authenticity was secondary to plausibility. This idea, that perception outweighs physical reality, extended far beyond individual installations. It became a guiding principle of large-scale Allied deception strategies, most notably Operation Fortitude. Sustaining this illusion throughout the summer of 1944 demanded a level of coordination unprecedented in military history. Visual displays, sound effects, and electronic signals had to remain coherent across vast territories, encompassing thousands of square miles and dozens of units that existed solely on paper. At the center of this effort was the London Controlling Section, which maintained exhaustive master charts detailing the fictional movements, strength, and operational tempo of imaginary formations. One of the most elaborate constructs was the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, composed of 11 divisions that were either entirely fictitious or deliberately mislocated. On paper, each division represented roughly 15,000 soldiers, thousands of vehicles, and a full complement of logistical and administrative support. Every one of these components required a believable operational footprint. To sustain that footprint, Ghost Army units generated constant radio chatter that mirrored real military life. Requests for supplies, reports of wounded personnel, disciplinary notices, and mundane bureaucratic exchanges. These transmissions established predictable routines, patterns of activity that German intelligence could observe, track, and ultimately trust. The illusion was not static. It lived and evolved, just as a genuine army would. Environmental conditions posed persistent threats to the deception. Heavy rainfall caused inflatable tanks and vehicles to sag or collapse as water pooled within their folds. Strong winds, anything above 30 miles per hour, could scatter entire mock motor pools overnight. In response, specialized teams were trained to conduct rapid repairs under cover of darkness, ensuring that reconnaissance aircraft would encounter intact formations at first light. Engineers added drainage channels, reinforced anchoring systems, and weighted foundations to stabilize the structures and prevent catastrophic failure. Parallel to these physical illusions ran an equally complex human deception. Allied intelligence services, particularly MI5's B-1A division, oversaw the double-cross system, a network of captured or turned German agents who fed controlled misinformation back to the Reich. Each agent's output was carefully monitored to ensure consistency, both internally and across the broader narrative of Allied intentions.
No case illustrates this complexity better than that of Juan Pujol Garcia, known to the British as Garbo. His entirely fictional spy ring consisted of 27 invented sub-agents, each with a distinct personality, handwriting style, and access to information. Together, they produced hundreds of reports each month. Pujol and his handler, Tomas Harris, meticulously crafted linguistic habits and behavioral quirks for every character, creating the impression of a sprawling, organic intelligence network. Managing this fiction extended even into financial records. German payments for intelligence had to be accepted and accounted for, with expenses logged to match the supposed costs of running such an extensive operation. When crises arose, they were addressed with theatrical precision. In one instance, when a non-existent sub-agent was said to have been arrested, British authorities placed carefully worded notices in regional newspapers, fabricated police documentation, and had Garbo report the loss to his handlers. Rather than growing suspicious, German intelligence praised him for maintaining discipline under pressure. The cumulative psychological impact of these fabrications was profound. German commanders were forced to weigh threats that had no physical basis, slowing decision-making at every level. Situation maps at Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's headquarters depicted Allied forces at nearly double their actual strength. Strategic uncertainty was further compounded by the structure of German command itself. Hitler retained direct authority over key armored reserves, meaning requests for redeployment passed through multiple layers, from frontline commanders to army groups to the high command and ultimately to Hitler, each step influenced by intelligence shaped by Allied deception. General Friedrich Dahlmann, tasked with defending Normandy, found himself trapped by this contradiction. While the invasion unfolded before him, intelligence reports continued to warn that the decisive blow would fall elsewhere. His appeals for reinforcements were rejected due to the perceived threat posed by phantom armies. On June 28, 1944, Dahlmann died, officially from a heart attack, though many historians believe the strain of the situation drove him to take his own life. Even as the Third Reich neared collapse, deception operations did not cease. In March 1945, during Operation Viersen, the Ghost Army executed its most ambitious tactical illusion. Over the course of 6 days, a force of just 600 men simulated the presence of the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions, nearly 40,000 troops, along the Rhine River near Dusseldorf. Through sound, signal, and sight,
they conjured an army that existed only in the minds of the enemy, proving once again that in modern warfare, belief itself could be a weapon. The complexity of the operation was not accidental. It was the culmination of nearly 12 months of continuous experimentation in large-scale military deception across the European theater. By early 1945, Allied planners had refined illusion into a disciplined craft. Acoustic deception units broadcast the sounds of bridge assembly and heavy engineering work, drawing enemy attention to false locations, while genuine river crossing preparations unfolded far beyond German observation. Elsewhere, entire vehicle parks appeared overnight, columns of tanks, trucks, and artillery that existed only as rubber and air. These decoys were intentionally left exposed, their camouflage deliberately imperfect, ensuring that enemy reconnaissance aircraft would notice them. At the same time, radio operators generated dense streams of fabricated communications. The transmissions portrayed the confusion, logistical bottlenecks, and command disputes expected of two full divisions preparing for a contested river assault. To German intelligence analysts, the signals were convincing precisely because they sounded flawed. Even as the Third Reich faced imminent collapse, the deception held. Wehrmacht units, still responsive to perceived threats in March 1945, shifted defensive positions to counter formations that had no physical existence. Artillery batteries, suffering from severe ammunition shortages, expended irreplaceable shells firing at targets that vanished when struck because they had never been real. The true Rhine crossing took place in sectors stripped of defenses after German forces were redeployed against these phantom armies. When Allied troops advanced, resistance was unexpectedly light. Casualties were minimal. What appeared, on the surface, to be a straightforward tactical success was in reality the final demonstration of an elaborate psychological and informational campaign. For decades after the war, the full scale of this deception remained concealed. Veterans of the so-called Ghost Army were bound by secrecy agreements that prohibited them from discussing their wartime service, not only publicly but even with close family members. This silence was not merely bureaucratic caution. In the emerging Cold War environment, military and intelligence leaders feared that revealing deception techniques could weaken future operations or expose vulnerabilities still in use. As a result, an extraordinary chapter of the war remained absent from public memory. The slow dismantling of this secrecy began in the 1970s. In 1972, J.C. Masterman's The Double Cross system disclosed the fundamental mechanics of Allied counterintelligence, despite strong resistance from British authorities. 2 years later, F.W. Winterbotham's The Ultra Secret revealed the role of code-breaking in shaping Allied strategy. Yet even these works only hinted at the breadth of battlefield deception. Comprehensive disclosure of Ghost Army operations did not occur until 1996, more than half a century after the fighting ended. This prolonged classification had real consequences. Many veterans passed away before their contributions were acknowledged. Early histories of D-Day and subsequent campaigns, written without access to deception records, offered incomplete and sometimes misleading interpretations. German officers, writing memoirs and operational analyses without realizing they had been systematically misled, unintentionally reinforced myths about Allied troop strength and deployment. When the archives finally opened, the material was astonishing. The Ghost Army's official history, compiled immediately after the war but locked away for decades, described operations so audacious that even seasoned military historians initially questioned their plausibility. Photographic evidence showed inflatable tanks, aircraft, and artillery so meticulously crafted that even at close range, they were nearly indistinguishable from authentic equipment. Captured German intelligence files, recovered in 1945 but fully examined only years later, confirmed that these illusions had been accepted as genuine. Enemy records contained detailed organizational charts for American units that never existed. Intelligence assessments carefully tracked the movements of entire formations composed entirely of sound, radio signals, and visual deception. When the U.S. National Archives released thousands of pages related to Operation Bodyguard and its subsidiary plans, the precision of the effort became unmistakable. This was not theatrical trickery, it was systematic manipulation of perception. Personal collections donated by former participants added depth to the official record. Private photographs taken by Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simonson showed soldiers proudly posing beside inflatable vehicles, images once stamped secret and hidden for 50 years. Diaries kept by Signal Corps operators revealed the psychological strain of sustaining false radio traffic, knowing that a single inconsistency could unravel months of planning. These accounts made clear that deception warfare demanded discipline, creativity, and constant vigilance. The revelation of how completely German intelligence had been misled had lasting effects. When the Bundeswehr was established in 1955, its training doctrine placed heavy emphasis on source verification, cross-checking intelligence, and resisting confirmation bias. These principles emerged directly from the recognition that World War II failures were not merely analytical errors, but the result of expertly engineered false realities. German military historians, granted access to Allied deception files, were forced to reevaluate long-held conclusions. Engagements previously blamed on poor leadership were reinterpreted as logical responses to fabricated intelligence. Commanders once criticized for incompetence were reassessed more sympathetically. They had made rational decisions based on information deliberately designed to deceive them. General Heinz Guderian, revising his memoirs after learning the extent of Allied deception, wrote that Germany's defeat could not be explained by material disadvantage alone. He concluded that German forces had fought armies that existed only in their imagination, while the real enemy advanced unopposed. He described this realization as more devastating than conventional military defeat, a blow to professional identity itself. The legacy of the Ghost Army extended far beyond the battlefield. Its techniques reshaped post-war military thought, influenced intelligence doctrine across NATO, and left a quieter imprint through the lives of its veterans, many of whom went on to distinguished careers in art, design, engineering, and public service. What had once been dismissed as illusion was finally recognized as one of the most precise and consequential weapons of the war.
For decades after the Second World War, a small group of American veterans kept silent about the roles they had played. Their military records existed, but the details were buried under layers of classification. Like many who served in secret units, they returned to civilian life without recognition, medals, or public acknowledgement. Their silence was not born of modesty alone, it was enforced by secrecy. Only many years later, when these men had reached their 70s and 80s, did fragments of their experiences begin to surface. When they finally spoke, their accounts sounded implausible, even surreal. They described battles fought without bullets, victories achieved with illusion, and military success built on sound, rubber, and misdirection rather than firepower. To those unfamiliar with wartime deception, the stories seemed closer to fantasy than history. During reunion gatherings in the 1990s, it became clear that these aging veterans shared an extraordinary past. They had belonged to one of the most unconventional and imaginative units ever assembled by a modern army, a force later known to the public as the Ghost Army. Comprised largely of artists, designers, engineers, and sound specialists, these men had participated in one of history's most inventive military experiments. Public awareness remained limited until the release of The Ghost Army, a documentary film released in 2013. The film introduced audiences to a hidden chapter of World War II and finally brought recognition to a unit that had helped shape the outcome of the war from the shadows. At screenings across the country, surviving veterans, now in their 90s, were greeted with standing ovations. For many, it was the first time their service had been publicly honored. That long overdue recognition reached its highest point on March 21, 2024, when the United States Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Ghost Army. Only 3 veterans were still alive to witness the moment in person: Bernard Blunstein, 100 years old, John Chrisman, 99, and Seymour Nussenbaum, also 99. They stood not only for themselves, but as representatives of the roughly 1,100 men who had once transformed deception into a decisive weapon of war. Tragically, shortly after the ceremony, one of those veterans passed away. By late 2024, only 2 known survivors of the Ghost Army remained. Their dwindling numbers underscored the urgency of preserving the legacy of a unit that had permanently altered the nature of military intelligence.
The Ghost Army's operations, alongside broader Allied deception efforts such as Operation Fortitude, reshaped strategic thinking for generations to come. These missions demonstrated that manipulating an enemy's expectations and beliefs could achieve outcomes that brute force alone could not. During the Cold War, this principle became a cornerstone of intelligence doctrine and continues to influence military planning in the modern era. The Allied objective was not simply to outnumber German armor or overwhelm defenses directly. Instead, the strategy relied on convincing German command that massive Allied forces were positioned where they did not, in fact, exist. Inflatable tanks, staged radio traffic, false troop movements, and carefully engineered soundscapes created a convincing illusion of overwhelming strength. Intelligence agencies around the world studied these operations closely after the war. They extracted critical lessons about deception, counterintelligence, and the management of perception. One of the most important insights was psychological rather than technological. The operations revealed how deeply confirmation bias could shape intelligence analysis. German intelligence officers tended to accept evidence that reinforced their assumptions while ignoring information that contradicted their expectations. That vulnerability has never disappeared. Modern intelligence systems, despite advances in data processing and surveillance, remain susceptible to the same human tendencies that shaped decisions during World War II. Measured statistically, Operation Fortitude stands as one of the most effective examples of force multiplication in military history. A relatively small group of Ghost Army personnel successfully immobilized vast numbers of German troops near Pas-de-Calais. When combined with other Allied deception units, fewer than 3,000 individuals succeeded in diverting between 400,000 and 500,000 German soldiers across the broader campaign. No conventional battlefield operation has ever achieved a comparable ratio of effort to effect. The financial efficiency was equally remarkable. The entire deception program cost less than a single squadron of heavy bombers, yet its strategic impact rivaled or exceeded that of sustained bombing campaigns. Every dollar invested in inflatable equipment, sound systems, and double-agent networks forced the Germans to waste hundreds more in manpower, fuel, and logistics defending against threats that were never real. Time amplified the advantage. German forces remained positioned near Pas-de-Calais for approximately 7 weeks after the Normandy landings, 49 critical days during which elite units could have been redeployed to challenge the Allied beachhead. Each day of delay allowed the Allies to land reinforcements, stockpile supplies, and prepare the operations that would eventually break through German defenses. Beyond its immediate military impact, the Ghost Army left a surprising civilian legacy. Technologies developed for wartime deception found new uses in peacetime industries. Inflatable structures designed to mimic tanks and vehicles influenced the development of emergency shelters and temporary architecture. Advances in acoustic projection contributed to modern outdoor sound systems, with concert engineering tracing part of its lineage to experiments conducted by Bell Labs during the war. Radio deception techniques helped lay groundwork for early electronic warfare and influenced emerging fields in computer science. The structured patterns used to generate false radio traffic later informed early approaches to random number generation. Materials research conducted to produce durable, weather-resistant inflatables fed directly into the development of aircraft evacuation slides, rescue rafts, and safety equipment still in use today. Perhaps the Ghost Army's most enduring legacy lies in its philosophical impact. It proved that creativity could be weaponized, that artists could serve as soldiers, and that imagination could rival firepower in determining the outcome of a war. When these men returned to civilian life, they carried with them a deep understanding of perception, illusion, and reality, insights that shaped careers in art, design, education, and technology. Their success helped shift attitudes toward the role of creative disciplines in national defense, contributing to increased institutional support for arts education in the post-war era. In the end, the Ghost Army demonstrated a timeless truth of modern conflict. Victory does not always belong to the side with the most weapons, but often to the side that best controls what the enemy believes to be true. After the Second World War, American cultural influence expanded at an unprecedented scale. Among the forces driving this transformation were thousands of returning veterans, many of them artists, designers, architects, and performers, who had discovered during wartime that creativity itself could shape outcomes. They learned, often firsthand, that reality is not only defined by physical facts, but by perception. This understanding, forged in the context of elaborate military deceptions, would leave a lasting imprint on American art, visual culture, design philosophy, and strategic thinking for decades to come.
One of the clearest demonstrations of this principle was Operation Fortitude, a vast Allied deception campaign that reshaped modern concepts of warfare. In today's world, defined by psychological operations, algorithmic influence, deepfake technologies, and large-scale manipulation through digital media, the lessons of fortitude feel strikingly contemporary. What was once achieved with canvas, rubber, and radio static is now executed through data, networks, and virtual identities. Military academies across the globe continue to analyze Operation Fortitude as a landmark case in strategic misdirection. It is no longer treated as a supplementary trick or clever ruse, but as a foundational example of how deception can function as a core element of doctrine. Modern armed forces formally recognize deception as a strategic pillar, capable of shaping entire campaigns without direct confrontation. Yet fortitude also raises enduring ethical questions. Its success depended on systematic falsehoods, lies told not only to enemy forces, but embedded within a web of information that required extraordinary moral calculation. Contemporary military ethicists still debate where the boundary lies between legitimate strategic deception and morally hazardous manipulation, especially when deception becomes comprehensive rather than tactical. As time passes and the last surviving members of the so-called Ghost Army fade from living memory, historians are compelled to reassess the magnitude of what these individuals achieved. In 1944, their average age was just 21. Conventional military theory at the time held that battles could only be won through force, attrition, and destruction. These young men proved otherwise. They helped secure victory without firing shots, defeating enemy formations through illusion rather than violence. German divisions remained immobilized, guarding coastlines and regions against invasions that were never intended to occur. They did so because American artists, sound engineers, and radio operators made those invasions feel inevitable. The Ghost Army demonstrated that imagination, when systematically applied, could rival tanks and artillery in strategic power. It is essential to note that the German commanders deceived by these operations were neither incompetent nor naive. They were experienced professionals, trained at respected military institutions, seasoned by years of combat, and supported by advanced intelligence networks. Nonetheless, they were thoroughly misled by inflatable armored vehicles, pre-recorded battlefield noise, and carefully scripted radio traffic that described entire armies that did not exist.
In the present era, physical decoys have largely given way to digital ones. Inflatable tanks have been replaced by fabricated online movements. Double agents have been supplanted by coordinated social media narratives. Cyber operations now generate illusions of capability and intent that far exceed anything possible in 1944. Despite these changes, the underlying logic remains identical. In conflict, belief often matters more than material reality. The artists who erected rubber tanks in fields across England revealed something profoundly unsettling about the future of war. They showed that conflicts might be decided not by soldiers on front lines, but by those who control narratives, not through destruction, but through distortion, not necessarily by generals, but by creatives who understand how the human mind constructs truth. The German military would not learn of the phantom armies until after their defeat was complete. By then, the consequences were irreversible. The loss was not only territorial or military, but psychological. The realization that enormous resources had been wasted fighting enemies that never existed. In this sense, the Ghost Army achieved one of the strangest victories in military history. They compelled their adversary to undermine itself. Their accomplishment continues to resonate in an age where perception has become a contested domain. The props of their trade have vanished, the rubber has decayed, the sound recordings have fallen silent, the radio transmissions have ceased. Yet the strategic echo of their work persists, louder than ever. In an environment dominated by information warfare, the most formidable force may not be the one with the largest arsenal, but the one that occupies space in the opponent's imagination. The German army learned this truth too late, guarding against spectral threats while real offensives unfolded elsewhere. The unresolved question facing the modern world is whether we have absorbed this lesson in time. When information itself becomes weaponized, reality is no longer a stable ground, it is a battlefield. And the most dangerous adversaries may not be external forces at all, but the illusions we are taught to believe.